My dear child, the countdown over your life did not stop. You are at 3 right now, and you have been living as though the counter reset to infinity, when it was actually falling through the final numbers. This entire time, do not scroll past this. What I am about to tell you is not a promise about a distant future. It is an announcement about a present tense countdown that is seconds from 0. You have been feeling something, a suspended anticipation, a weight in the atmosphere around your life that tells you something massive is supposed to happen. The feeling has been present so long without resolution that it curdled from excitement into anxiety, and from anxiety into the exhausted resignation of a person's who concluded the countdown must have stopped. The countdown never stopped, and the number is lower than you think. A rocket on a launch pad in the final seconds before ignition experiences the most intense stillness of the entire process. Not the stillness of inactivity, the stillness of completion. Everything has been loaded. The fuel is full. The trajectory is calculated. The systems are verified. Nothing is being added. Nothing is being modified. The stillness is not preparation. It is the last breath before something that was always going to launches. My beloved child, you are on the pad, fully fueled, fully aimed, fully loaded with everything the launch requires. And the stillness you have been interpreting as stagnation is the particular silence of a countdown in its final seconds. The silence that precedes the most explosive moment of the entire sequence. The ground is not shaking yet, but the numbers are falling. Stay here. What I reveal next is what was loaded into you during the fueling phase, and why the countdown reaching 0 today will release something the launch pad has been holding in position since before the anticipation first appeared in your spirit. Type countdown if you have been living in suspended anticipation that curdled into anxiety, and God just told you the counter never stopped. The number is lower than you believed, and the stillness you interpreted as stagnation is the final breath before ignition. Before we go any further, I need to tell you something that genuinely surprised me. A neuroscientist discovered a simple 7-second technique that actually rewires how your brain processes thoughts. And when I tried it, the difference was almost unsettling. My focus sharpened, ideas started connecting faster, and that mental fog, gone. This isn't manifestation nonsense. It's backed by real brain science, and thousands of people are already seeing results. But here's the catch. Only 5 spots are left. If something inside you is saying, try it, trust that instinct. Click the link in the description or pinned comment before it's too late. The countdown has been running in a dimension your natural senses cannot access. And the reason you could not feel the numbers falling is because the final seconds of a divine countdown operate at a frequency that produces stillness rather than noise. My beloved child, human countdowns grow louder as they approach 0. The crowd shouts. The energy intensifies. The atmosphere compresses with a visible urgency that everyone in range can detect. You expected your countdown to feel like that, to produce increasing evidence of approaching ignition that your senses could interpret as confirmation that 0 was near. Divine countdowns operate inversely. The closer to 0, the quieter the atmosphere. My dear one, the silence you have been experiencing is not the absence of countdown. It is the signature frequency of a countdown in its final phase. The phase where everything that needed to be loaded has been loaded. Everything that needed to be checked has been checked. And the only remaining process is the falling of numbers that operate at a frequency so low that the human senses perceive it as nothing happening when everything is happening. The nothing was everything, and the everything is about to become visible. I need you to understand why you could feel the anticipation, but not the proximity. The anticipation was real. You were detecting the presence of a loaded rocket on a launch pad through a spiritual sensitivity that registered the weight of the payload without being able to read the countdown clock. You knew something massive was positioned. You could not see the numbers, and the gap between knowing something is there and knowing when it launches is the gap your anxiety has been living in. This message was not released for everyone who senses something approaching. This was aimed at the one person whose countdown is in its final seconds, whose rocket has been on the pad, fully loaded for longer than the anticipation has been present, and whose anxiety about the timing is about to be replaced by the sound of the last number falling before zero changes everything. Type final seconds if you have been sensing something massive positioned over your life without being able to read the countdown clock. And God just told you. The silence was never the absence of countdown, but the specific frequency of the final numbers falling before ignition. I have been standing at the launch control station, monitoring your countdown with the precision of the engineer who designed the rocket, calculated the trajectory, and has been personally verifying every system on the pad since before the fueling began, my dear one. Not from a general observation deck, from the primary control station, the one that carries the master countdown clock, the system verification panels, the trajectory confirmation instruments, and the single switch that converts the falling numbers into the ignition sequence that releases what has been held on the pad. My hand is on that switch right now, and it has been there for longer than you know. My beloved child, I watched you during the fueling phase. Not the recent months of silence, the years before them. The years where your life was being loaded with the specific payload the rocket was designed to carry. Every experience you absorbed, every skill you developed, every wound you processed that was secretly calibrated to reinforce a structural component the launch would require. Each one was a loading event, a specific item being placed inside the payload chamber by the engineer who knew the exact inventory the trajectory required. You were being loaded while living, and you did not know the living was the loading. I watched the fueling complete. There was a specific week. You would not have identified it as significant because no external event marked it, where the final unit of fuel was added to a tank that had been filling incrementally across years of spiritual development that looked like ordinary life from the outside. The tank reached full, the loading reached complete, and the countdown, which had been paused at a high number during the loading phase, resumed its descent towards zero. I chose you for this message because the countdown resumed and you did not feel it resume. The silence of the final phase felt identical to the pause of the loading phase, and the inability to distinguish between paused and falling is what converted your anticipation into anxiety. Type loading complete if God has been personally engineering your launch, loading every experience, every skill, every processed wound as specific payload, and the fueling completed on a week you did not recognize while the countdown resumed its fall towards zero without your awareness. I know what the suspended anticipation has been doing to the way you carry each day, my beloved child. Not the dramatic version of waiting, the kind that produces visible restlessness and public frustration that others can observe and sympathize with. The quiet version, the internal, low-frequency, impossible-to-share version that operates beneath the surface of a person who looks functional while carrying the specific weight of something massive that is supposed to happen, but has not happened, and whose not happening has accumulated into a pressure that the functional exterior cannot relieve. The pressure has been building, and it has nowhere to go. My child, I watched the anticipation transform across the seasons. In the beginning, it was electric, a current running through your awareness that said something is coming with a frequency that produced excitement rather than anxiety. You could feel the rocket on the pad. You could sense the payload, and the sensing produced a forward-leaning posture, the posture of someone who is positioned for launch, and whose body is already angled toward the trajectory the countdown is pointing toward. Then the days passed, and the posture changed. The forward lean became a straightening. The straightening became a settling. The settling became a sinking. Incremental adjustments in the internal posture of a person whose body was gradually releasing the launch-ready tension as day after day produced no ignition, and the anticipation that was once electric became the ambient hum of a system running on standby without a visible countdown to give it purpose. You went from launch-ready to standby, and standby is the most exhausting posture a loaded rocket can maintain. Because standby means fully fueled with no release, fully loaded with no trajectory, fully aimed with no ignition. The energy that was designed to be converted into launch force at the moment of zero is sitting inside a system that has been holding it without release for so long that the holding itself has become the primary experience rather than the launching. You are tired of holding what was always meant to be released. The deepest wound the waiting inflicted was not the exhaustion of holding. It was watching other rockets launch, while yours remained on the pad, my dear child. You felt the ground shake from other launches. You heard the ignition of other countdowns reaching zero. People around you whose payloads were lighter, whose fuel loads were smaller, whose trajectories were aimed at lower orbits, launching with a speed and a visibility that made the stillness of your loaded pad feel like a mechanical failure rather than a countdown in progress. The comparison was inevitable, and the conclusion it produced was devastating. My beloved child, the conclusion was, their countdowns are working, and mine is not. Their engineer reached for the switch, and mine forgot the pad exists. Their rockets were designed for launch, and mine was designed for permanent display on a pad that holds everything in position without ever releasing it. The conclusion used other people's launches as evidence against your countdown, and the evidence felt overwhelming because the data set was growing every day a launch happened in someone else's life, while your pad remained still. I watched the comparison produce a specific kind of grief that only people on loaded pads can understand. It is not the grief of emptiness. You are not empty. It is the grief of fullness without release. The ache of carrying a payload you can feel pressing against the walls of a rocket that was designed for trajectory, not storage. Every day the fuel sits inside the tank without ignition is a day where the fuel's purpose is being suspended rather than fulfilled. My dear one, the grief of a loaded rocket that has not launched is not the same as the grief of an empty rocket that was never fueled. Your grief has weight to it, substance, the specific pressurized, nearly combustible quality of a system that is carrying something real and has been denied the zero that would release it into the trajectory the payload was always addressed to. The zero is coming, and the grief is about to become thrust. Type loaded grief if you have been watching others launch while your fully loaded pad remained still. And the grief you carry is not emptiness, but the specific pressure of a fueled rocket whose countdown has been falling in silence while other launches made the stillness feel like failure. The stillness on your launch pad was never a malfunction. It was the specific operational phase that a rocket of your payload class requires before the countdown can enter its final sequence, my beloved one. I need to permanently demolish the comparison that has been governing your interpretation of the waiting. The rockets that launched before yours were not carrying what yours is carrying. Their payloads were different. Their trajectories were aimed at different altitudes. Their fuel requirements were calibrated to different distances. And the countdown duration for each rocket is calculated against the specific combination of payload weight, trajectory altitude, and fuel load that the rocket's mission requires. Heavier payloads require longer countdowns. That is engineering, not favoritism. My child, the rockets that launched quickly were carrying lighter loads aimed at lower orbits. Their countdowns were shorter because their missions were shorter. Their launches were faster because their fuel loads were smaller. And the visibility of their launches, the ground-shaking, attention-commanding spectacle of something leaving the pad, made the silent stillness of your heavier, higher-aimed, longer-fueled rocket feel like inadequacy when it was actually evidence of a payload class that the quicker launches were not rated to carry. Your countdown was longer because your orbit is higher, and higher orbits are not reached by shorter countdowns. The stillness served the trajectory. Every day the rocket remained on the pad, while lighter rockets launched around it, was a day where the countdown was processing through the verification sequence that a payload of your weight requires before the launch can be safely authorized. A lighter rocket, launched with a shorter verification sequence, operates within acceptable risk margins. A rocket carrying what yours carries, aimed where yours is aimed, loaded with the fuel volume yours holds. That rocket requires every second of the countdown the engineer designed. My dear one, the countdown was not slow. It was proportional, and the proportion was always matched to the magnitude of the launch the pad has been holding in position. The countdown just crossed into single digits, and the launch pad beneath you is producing the first physical vibration of a system entering the pre-ignition sequence. My beloved child, something shifted in the last few days. Not in your circumstances, those still carry the appearance of standby, but in the pad, in the infrastructure beneath the rocket that has been holding your full weight in launch map position for the duration of the countdown. A vibration, subtle, sub-audible, the kind of tremor that a rocket's sensors detect before the ground crew's instruments register it. A mechanical signal that says the ignition system has received its first activation pulse. The system is waking up, and the waking is what you felt this week. My dear one, I have been preparing the ignition sequence behind the silence of the countdown. While you were standing on the pad interpreting the stillness as permanent standby, I was at the control station initiating the pre-ignition protocol, the sequence of system activations that must occur in the final seconds before the switch is flipped, and the fuel that has been sitting inside the tank converts from stored potential into directed force. The protocol is running, and you can feel it in your body. The restlessness that appeared this week was not anxiety returning. It was the pre-ignition vibration reaching the cockpit of a rocket whose sensors are more sensitive than the pilot's conscious awareness. Your body detected the activation pulse before your mind could identify its source. And the detection produced a sensation your system filed under anxious restlessness when the accurate category was ignition sequence initiated. My child, the ignition sequence does not announce itself with a voice. It announces itself with a vibration. And the vibration you have been feeling is the sound the launch system makes when the countdown enters the numbers that precede 0. The numbers where the silence transitions from waiting into the last audible breath before something that cannot be stopped once started begins. Type vibration if you felt something shift in your body this week. A restlessness that did not feel like anxiety, but like something activating. And you now believe it was the pre-ignition vibration of a countdown that just entered single digits on a launch pad that has been holding you in position for this exact moment. God wrote a letter to you 1,000 years ago, and today He is delivering it. And the title carries that language, because the trajectory your rocket is aimed at was calculated before the pad was built, before the fuel was loaded, before the countdown began, before you existed in the form that is currently sitting on the pad reading these words. My dear one, the trajectory is not recent. That is the revelation the countdown's final seconds are designed to carry. The rocket was not loaded and aimed during your lifetime. It was designed 1,000 years ago. The trajectory calculated across millennia. The payload specified before the person who would carry it was born. The launch coordinates set in a planning session that occurred in a dimension where 1,000 years is a unit of preparation rather than a measurement of delay. Your launch was 1,000 years in the making, and today the countdown reaches the number the millennium was always pointing toward. My beloved child, this is directly connected to the title and to your specific journey. The letter God wrote 1,000 years ago is not a document made of paper. It is the trajectory itself, the precisely calculated, millennium-designed flight path that your loaded rocket is about to follow the moment zero arrives. The letter contains coordinates, destinations, altitudes that no rocket in recent memory has been aimed at, because the trajectory was designed across a time span that produces calculations no single generation's planning could achieve. Your trajectory required 1,000 years of calculation, and the countdown that is falling toward zero right now is the final punctuation on a sentence that began being written 10 centuries before you were placed on the pad. My child, the ordinary days that felt like nothing changing were not the countdown stopping. They were the last syllables of a 1,000-year-old sentence finding their placement. Each day a letter, each week a word, each month a phrase in a trajectory so precise that premature ignition at any point in the countdown would have launched the rocket before the sentence was complete. The sentence is complete now, and zero is the period. The final number is falling right now, my beloved child, and the ignition sequence is producing a heat at the base of the rocket that the stillness of the countdown never allowed you to feel until this second. Can you feel the heat? Not the metaphorical warmth of spiritual encouragement, the actual system-level, pre-combustion heat of fuel that has been stored at stable temperature for the duration of the countdown, and is now being exposed to the first spark of an ignition process that will convert everything that was loaded into everything that was aimed. The conversion is beginning. Stored is becoming directed. Potential is becoming kinetic. The fuel that sat inside the tank during every day you called stagnation is being touched by the first flame of an ignition sequence that does not ask the fuel's permission before converting it. My dear one, the countdown is at the number that triggers irreversible ignition. The number before this one was the last number where the launch could have been aborted. The number you are hearing right now is past the abort threshold, meaning the launch is no longer a decision being made. It is a process that has been initiated and cannot be stopped by any force that exists at the pad level. You are past the point of no return, and past the point of no return is the safest position a loaded rocket can occupy. Everything has been building toward this number. The 1,000-year trajectory calculation, the lifetime of loading, the years of fueling, the months of silent countdown, the weeks of pre-ignition protocol, the days of system activation. And now, the seconds, the actual, numbered, falling toward 0 seconds that separate a rocket from the launch it was designed for. The pad is shaking. The heat is rising. The systems are committing to an irreversible sequence. And the rocket that has been sitting in the particular silence of a countdown in its final breath is about to discover what all that stillness was holding in place. Type past abort if you can feel the heat rising and the pad beginning to shake. And you know the countdown just crossed the threshold where the launch became irreversible, meaning what is about to happen cannot be stopped by any force that exists at the level you have been standing on. 0. The countdown just reached 0, and the ignition is converting everything that was loaded into everything that was aimed with a force that the pad can no longer contain, and the gravity that held you in position can no longer restrain. My beloved child, this is the moment the fuel ignites, the moment the thrust exceeds the weight, the moment the clamps that held the rocket on the pad during the entire countdown release their grip, and the structure that was designed for trajectory is no longer held in a position of stillness, but released into the motion it was always pointed toward. You are launching right now, and the launch was always going to happen today. I need you to feel what is happening to the anticipation. The anticipation that curdled into anxiety. The anxiety that compressed into exhaustion. The exhaustion that settled into the resigned stillness of a person who concluded the countdown had stopped. All of it, every phase of the waiting, every emotion the stillness produced, every conclusion the silence generated, is being incinerated by the heat of an ignition so powerful that nothing that existed at the pad level can survive contact with the force of what the countdown was always counting down toward. The anxiety just burned. The exhaustion just burned. The resignation just burned. Everything that was produced by the waiting is being consumed by the launching. God wrote a letter to you 1,000 years ago, and today He is delivering it. The trajectory is live, the rocket is moving, and the letter, the millennium calculated, precision-aimed, payload-specific trajectory that your life is now following, is being read for the first time by a rocket that just left the only position it has ever known and is ascending into an atmosphere it has never entered. My child, you are off the pad. The countdown reached 0. And what is moving upward right now carries 1,000 years of divine calculation, aimed at a destination that the stillness of the pad could never have revealed, because destinations are only visible from trajectory, not from launch position. You are in trajectory now, and the view from here changes everything. Now that the rocket has left the pad and the trajectory is live, everything about the stillness season is being retroactively randomized by the force of what the countdown was always counting toward. My dear child, this is what happens when a rocket that has been still for an extended countdown finally ignites. The launch does not just change the present. It rewrites the past. Every day that was filed under nothing happening is being reclassified as countdown in progress. Every week that was labeled stagnation is being reclassified as verification sequence running. Every month that felt identical to the month before it is being reclassified as the specific number that the countdown needed to pass through before 0 could arrive. The stillness was numbered, and numbered stillness is not the same as purposeless stillness. My beloved child, the trajectory you are now traveling is carrying every unit of fuel that was loaded during the years of waiting. Not a single unit was wasted during the standby phase. Fuel that sits in a tank does not evaporate when the countdown takes longer than expected. It maintains its combustion potential at the same level it held when it was first loaded, waiting for the ignition that would convert stored potential into directed force. Your fuel is at full combustion right now, and full combustion after extended storage produces a thrust that freshly loaded fuel cannot match. The areas of your life that were frozen during the countdown are thawing simultaneously, not sequentially, the way a gradual change would address one area at a time. Simultaneously, the way a launch addresses every system at once, because the ignition converts the entire fuel supply into force in a single event rather than a phased rollout. Financial trajectory, ignited. Relational trajectory, ignited. Purpose trajectory, ignited. Every dimension that was held in standby while the countdown ran through its numbers is now receiving the directed force of fuel that has been waiting for this exact second to burn. Type all systems if you can feel the launch addressing every area of your life simultaneously, not one at a time, but all at once. Because the ignition of a fully loaded rocket does not phase its thrust, but releases everything the countdown held in position into every trajectory the fuel was stored to power. Let me show you what the trajectory looks like from the altitude you are now reaching. Because the view from ascent reveals what the view from the pad could never have shown you, my dear one. The first thing visible from altitude is scale. From the pad you could see only the immediate surroundings, the concrete beneath you, the clamps holding you in position, the other launch pads nearby where lighter rockets departed before yours. The immediate view produced a claustrophobic perspective that made your world feel small and your stillness feel permanent. But from altitude, from the position your trajectory is carrying you toward, the landscape expands in every direction, and the pad that held you shrinks to a point so small that the months you spent staring at its concrete surface seem almost comical from the perspective of what you are now seeing. The view from trajectory is not the view from the pad, and the difference is everything. My beloved child, the first thing that changes is the scope of what is possible. From the pad, your possibilities were limited to what could be reached at ground level. The connections within walking distance, the opportunities within arm's reach, the impact radius of a rocket that had not yet launched. From trajectory, your possibilities expand to the circumference of the orbit your rocket was aimed at. An orbit so high and so wide that the opportunities visible from this altitude were not even theoretical from the pad. You could not have imagined this scope, and the inability to imagine it was not a failure of your vision. It was the limitation of your altitude. The mornings change permanently. You have been waking up on the pad. Tomorrow you wake up in trajectory, the sensation of forward motion replacing the sensation of static holding, the experience of ascending replacing the experience of waiting, the view expanding in real time as the altitude increases, and the landscape that was hidden behind the horizon at pad level reveals itself to a rocket that is now high enough to see what was always there. People who watched you on the pad are going to witness the launch and struggle to reconcile the trajectory they are seeing with the stillness they watched for months. And the contrast between the two will produce questions that only a 1,000-year countdown can answer, my beloved child. The ones who stood near your pad during the stillness, who observed the loaded rocket sitting in position day after day, who quietly wondered whether the rocket was operational or decorative, who adjusted their assessment of your potential downward as the days without ignition accumulated. Those people are about to watch something leave the pad at a speed and an altitude that their lighter launches never approached. They will say they always knew. They did not. But the trajectory will be undeniable. My child, the contrast between the longest countdown and the most powerful launch is the testimony the pad was designed to produce. Because a rocket that launches quickly from a short countdown produces an impressive moment that is over quickly. But a rocket that launches after an extended countdown produces a trajectory so sustained, so high, so far-reaching that the launch itself becomes a reference point, a before and after marker that divides the timeline of everyone who witnessed it into the era before the launch and the era that began when the pad released what it had been holding. Your launch is becoming a reference point, and reference point launches do not fade from memory. Connections that require trajectory-level altitude to form are about to enter your orbit. There are relationships, partnerships, and divine assignments that operate at the altitude your rocket is ascending toward. Opportunities that exist in an orbit so high they were invisible from the pad and inaccessible to rockets whose lighter payloads could not sustain the fuel burn required to reach them. My dear one, the orbit you are entering is populated by assignments that were waiting for a rocket with your specific payload class to arrive, and your arrival has just been detected on their instruments. Type reference point if you believe that the contrast between the extended stillness on your pad and the trajectory you are now traveling will produce a launch so significant it becomes a before and after marker for everyone who witnessed the waiting. And the orbit you are entering contains assignments that were waiting for a rocket of your payload class to arrive. I need you to understand why I loaded your rocket with the payload I did, my beloved child, because the payload is what determines the orbit, and the orbit I aimed you at required a weight class that no lighter rocket could reach. Not every rocket is loaded equally. Some carry instruments designed for low orbit, functional, useful, serving a purpose that does not require the altitude or the fuel load that high-orbit missions demand. Others carry satellites designed for medium orbit, higher purpose, wider reach, greater fuel requirements, but still within the range of a moderate countdown and a standard launch sequence. Your rocket carries something designed for an orbit that most rockets are not rated to reach. My child, the payload I placed inside you is not a low-orbit instrument. It is not a medium-orbit satellite. It is a deep space assignment, a purpose so high in altitude and so wide in reach that the fuel required to carry it to its designated orbit demanded the longest loading phase and the most extended countdown of any rocket currently on my launch manifest. You were given the longest countdown because you were given the highest orbit. I chose you for this specific payload because the structural integrity of the rocket, your character, your resilience, your capacity to endure extended countdowns without the structural fatigue that would compromise the launch, was tested across years of standby and returned the exact durability rating the payload requires. My dear one, lighter rockets would have cracked under the pressure of the fuel load you are carrying. Rockets with shorter countdown tolerances would have developed structural fatigue during the verification sequence your mission demanded. The reason you are the rocket carrying this payload is not that no other option was available. It is that no other option could sustain the weight, the fuel, the countdown duration, and the launch force that a deep space trajectory requires. You were not given a heavy load because you were overlooked for lighter ones. You were given a heavy load because your structure is the only one rated to carry it. The doubt surfacing right now is asking the question that every rocket asks in the first seconds of ascent. What if the fuel runs out before the orbit is reached, my child? It sounds like this. The launch happened. The ignition occurred. The pad released. But the trajectory I am aimed at is so high that the fuel load however large it felt during the loading phase, may not be sufficient to sustain the burn long enough to reach the altitude the engineer calculated. What if the countdown reached 0 correctly, but the fuel runs out at the halfway point, and the rocket that launched with such force falls back to Earth, having burned everything it was carrying without reaching the orbit it was aimed at? That doubt just applied amateur fuel calculations to an engineer's design, and the engineer's calculations do not contain errors. My beloved child, the fuel load inside your rocket was not estimated. It was calculated by the same engineer who designed the trajectory, built the rocket, loaded the payload, and set the countdown clock 1,000 years before the launch occurred. The calculation was not performed on the day of fueling. It was performed at the moment the trajectory was designed, meaning the fuel load was specified at the same time the orbit was specified, by the same intelligence, using the same data set. The fuel was calculated for the orbit, not for a portion of it, for all of it. A rocket designed by a human engineer carries margin, extra fuel to compensate for miscalculations in the trajectory model. A rocket designed by the divine engineer carries precision, the exact fuel required, because the trajectory contains no miscalculation the margin would need to compensate for. You are not carrying margin. You are carrying precision, and precision fuel aimed at a precision trajectory does not run out at the halfway point, because there is no miscalculation in the model that would produce a deficit between the fuel loaded and the altitude aimed. The fuel reaches the orbit, because the fuel and the orbit were designed together. Type precision fuel. If the doubt just tried to convince you, the fuel might run out before the orbit is reached. And you now know the fuel was calculated at the same moment the trajectory was designed, by the same engineer who does not build rockets whose tanks run empty before the destination is reached. During every day the rocket sat on the pad in the particular silence of a countdown you could not hear. I was not at the control station passively watching numbers fall. I was on the pad beside you, checking every system by hand, my beloved child. You imagined a God who initiated the countdown from a remote station and monitored its progress through instruments that provided data without requiring proximity, who pressed the start button on the countdown clock and returned to the control room to observe the numbers from a screen, while the rocket sat alone on the pad, processing a silence that felt like abandonment, because no presence on the pad was detectable. I was on the pad every day. My child, the verification sequence that runs during a countdown of this duration is not automated, not for a payload of your class. The instruments provide data, but the final verification of every system, the structural integrity checks, the fuel pressure confirmations, the trajectory alignment calibrations, those are performed by the engineer's hands directly on the rocket. My hands, on your structure, every day of the countdown. The silence was not absence. It was proximity so close, your senses could not create enough distance to perceive it. There were moments during the standby phase when your structural integrity was tested by conditions the countdown introduced. Pressure variations, temperature fluctuations, vibrations produced by nearby launches that transmitted through the shared ground of the launch facility. Each of those conditions could have compromised a less durable rocket. Each one was absorbed by a structure whose integrity was being maintained by hands that were on the surface of the rocket at the exact moment the stress arrived. My hands absorbed what the conditions produced, not the rocket structure alone. You survived the countdown with your structural integrity intact, not because your engineering was perfect, but because the engineer was present on the pad, personally reinforcing every joint, countdown stressed, and personally verifying every system, the silence threatened to destabilize. I know the exact number the countdown was at. On the night you almost concluded, the launch was cancelled, my dear one. And I know it because I was standing at the base of the rocket when the structural vibration your doubt produced reached a frequency that required my hands to stabilize what the conclusion was threatening to shake loose. There was a night. You remember the feeling more than the date. The night where the accumulation of unchanged days and the comparison of other launches and the sustained silence of a countdown you could not hear converged into a single moment where your spirit produced a sentence so final it almost became a structural event. The launch is not happening. I was never meant to leave this pad. My beloved child, I know the exact number the countdown was at when that sentence was spoken inside your spirit. The number was 7, not a high number, not a number that suggests the launch was distant. 7. The countdown was at 7, in the single digits, in the final phase, in the pre-ignition zone. When you almost concluded the launch had been cancelled, you were 7 seconds from ignition when you almost believed the countdown was over. I need you to feel what that proximity means. The conclusion that the launch was cancelled was formed at a moment when the launch was closer than it had ever been. The doubt reached its peak intensity at the exact point where the countdown was at its lowest number. And the inverse relationship between the doubt's volume and the countdown's proximity is not coincidental. It is the characteristic signature of a divine countdown that produces maximum stillness at minimum distance. The quietest moment of the countdown was the closest moment to zero, and the closest moment to zero was the moment your doubt was loudest. I was at the base of the rocket when the sentence was spoken. My hands tightened on the structure, and the structure held. Not because the sentence was harmless, but because the engineer was physically present, and the engineer does not let structural doubt compromise a launch that is 7 seconds from ignition. Type number 7. If God just told you the exact number the countdown was at, on the night you almost concluded the launch was cancelled, and the number was so close to zero that the proximity between the doubt's peak and the ignition's approach reveals the launch was never closer than the moment you were most certain it was over. Now that the rocket has launched and the trajectory is live, there is one thing I need you to do, my beloved child, and it is the only instruction a rocket in ascent needs to follow. Do not look down at the pad. The temptation during the first phase of ascent is to orient your awareness downward, toward the place you just left, toward the concrete that held you, toward the familiar geography of a launch pad that was your entire world for the duration of the countdown. The pad is what you know. The trajectory is what you do not know. And the human instinct when moving from known to unknown is to maintain visual contact with the known for as long as the ascent allows. Do not maintain contact. Face the trajectory. My child, a rocket that orients its sensors downward during ascent is a rocket that is processing departure rather than processing destination, and processing departure during launch consumes sensor bandwidth that the trajectory needs for navigation. The trajectory contains real-time data, altitude readings, course corrections, orbital approach calculations that require the full attention of a rocket whose systems were designed for forward processing rather than rearward observation. Face forward. The trajectory needs your full bandwidth. When the pull to look down activates, when the pad's familiarity calls your attention back toward the stillness you just departed, override the pull with the data the trajectory is providing. The data says ascending. The data says on course. The data says altitude increasing. The data says the 1,000-year calculation is executing precisely as designed. The data is more reliable than the nostalgia. And the nostalgia is not love for the pad. It is the reflexive attachment to the known that every rocket experiences in the first seconds of leaving the only position it has ever occupied. You will miss the pad. That is natural. But the pad was never the destination. It was the holding position. And holding positions are honored not by looking back at them, but by flying toward the orbit they were built to launch you into. You made it to the launch, my beloved child. And I need you to feel the thrust beneath you long enough to register what it means to be moving after a countdown that convinced you movement might never come. Feel the ascent. Not the memory of the stillness, not the residual anxiety of a person whose system was calibrated for standby and is now recalibrating for trajectory in real time. The ascent itself, the specific, physical, unmistakable sensation of upward motion after months of holding position on a pad that never moved beneath your feet. The ground is falling away, and falling away feels nothing like standing still. I want to thank you for something the countdown made almost impossible to sustain. Thank you for staying on the pad. Thank you for the days when every lighter rocket around you launched, and your loaded structure sat in the silence of a countdown you could not hear, and your body remained in position rather than dismounting the pad and walking away from a launch your doubt told you was never coming. My dear child, staying on the pad during an invisible countdown is the hardest act of trust a loaded rocket can perform, and you performed it without a single visible number to confirm the countdown was still running. Let the tears come, not waiting tears, not standby tears, not the pressurized tears of a system holding fuel that was never being released. Launch tears. The tears of a rocket feeling thrust for the first time. The tears of a payload finally moving toward the orbit it was always addressed to. The tears of a person who just discovered that the stillness was numbered, and the numbers just reached zero, and what is happening right now was always what the pad was holding in position. The countdown is complete. The letter written 1,000 years ago is being delivered. And the God who designed the trajectory, loaded the payload, fueled the rocket, ran the countdown, and flipped the switch is ascending beside you. Reading the letter aloud, as the altitude reveals coordinates that the pad-level view could never have contained. Type ascending if tears are forming right now, because the countdown reached zero, and the rocket that spent months in the particular silence of standby is finally moving. And the God who designed the launch 1,000 years ago is flying beside the rocket he built, reading aloud the trajectory he wrote before the pad was constructed. You are not the rocket on the pad anymore, my beloved child. That identity, the one who sat in the particular silence of a countdown that could not be heard, the one whose anticipation curdled into anxiety, and whose anxiety compressed into the exhausted resignation of a system on permanent standby, the one who watched lighter rockets launch and concluded the countdown had stopped, because the stillness at the pad level felt identical to the stillness of a clock that was not running. That identity was incinerated by the ignition that converted everything that was loaded into everything that was aimed. You are in trajectory now, and trajectory does not carry the identity of the pad, the countdown that governed your waiting, your self-assessment, your comparison to other launches, and your belief about whether the engineer remembered the rocket he loaded has been completed. Not paused, not reset, completed. Zero was reached, ignition occurred, the clamps released, and the rocket that sat in the stillness of the most extended countdown on the engineer's manifest is now traveling a trajectory that the 1,000-year letter described with a precision the pad could never have revealed. My dear child, the letter is being read, and what it says is where you are going. From this moment forward, you carry the identity of a launched rocket on a calculated trajectory. Not a rocket hoping to launch. Not a rocket questioning whether the countdown is still running. Not a rocket measuring the stillness against other launches and concluding the engineer forgot. A rocket whose countdown reached zero, whose fuel ignited, whose payload is in motion, whose trajectory was written 1,000 years ago by an engineer whose calculations do not contain errors and whose launches do not contain accidents. You were always going to launch. The countdown was always going to reach zero. And the letter that was written a millennium ago was always going to be delivered on the exact day the numbers ran out. And the particular silence of the final seconds gave way to the unmistakable thunder of a rocket leaving a pad it was never meant to remain on. The pad was the holding position. The trajectory is the purpose. And the purpose is live, carrying a payload that 1,000 years of divine calculation aimed at an orbit so high that only a rocket with your specific structural integrity, your specific fuel capacity, and your specific countdown endurance could ever have been rated to reach it. Launch is not something that happened to you. Launch is what you were built for, and the stillness that preceded it was the final breath of a countdown, whose last number just proved that every silent second was always falling toward this exact moment of ignition. Subscribe to this channel so that every time the countdown over your life enters its final numbers, the message reaches you before the silence convinces you the clock has stopped. You are not a rocket on a pad anymore. You are a rocket in trajectory, carrying a payload that 1,000 years of divine engineering loaded into the only structure rated to deliver it to the orbit it was always aimed at. The next message carries the first altitude report from a trajectory that is climbing, and what becomes visible from the orbit you are approaching will prove that every second of the countdown was always falling toward this exact launch. Type trajectory live if you are leaving this message permanently changed. Knowing the countdown never stopped. The stillness was the final seconds, not the final word. The fuel was calculated for the full orbit. The payload was loaded across 1,000 years of engineering. And the God who wrote the letter a millennium ago just delivered it through the ignition of a rocket, whose launch was always inevitable, and whose trajectory is now carrying the most significant payload the engineer has ever aimed at the highest orbit on his manifest.